Everybody, and thank you for coming to this latest budget forum. It's good to see you here. The standard reminder on the screen that we're recording this so that people who are unable to be here this afternoon or people who would watch from Saskatoon or PA or wherever are able to see the recording. And we archive all of these things so that you've got the video, you've got the slide deck, together with all of the printed materials. We'll try to get through this deck fairly quickly today so that we reserve some time for your questions, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. If there's anything we can't answer, we will do our best to find the answer and get back to you at the next forum. If you would like to ask a question so that people off campus or people watching the recording can hear you, if you would come to the microphone here or there, just state your name and then ask your question, that would be much appreciated. So, at the last budget forum, for those of you who are present, we discussed several things. We gave a very brief overview of the national and the provincial contexts. Everybody knows what's going on with the economy. Everybody, I think, has heard bits and pieces of what's happening or being decided in a variety of provinces about post-secondary funding. We talked quickly about our 2015-16 operating revenues and expenses, and then move to our expenditure estimates for 2016-2017, the fiscal year that we're going into. And these are estimates at this point, of course. We highlighted the fact that tuition and fee revenue for the University of Regina now makes up 36% of the total operating budget. So every $100 that we spend on salaries and benefits and supplies and copyright and everything else, the supplies, or the operating expenses of the university, $36 out of that 100 comes out of the pockets of students in tuition and fees. We talked briefly about research revenue and how that contributes to the overall operation of the university, the indirect cost system. And Dave also highlighted some of the challenges that we're facing with the non-academic pension plan right now, together with, again, a number of universities across the country. There are challenges in that plan. All of that is available on the budget update page. Again, the full presentation is there with the slide deck. At the last budget forum, there were a couple of questions. What were the budget allocations last year, and where are they available? And we're going to discuss that in some detail today. Dave will take you through the spots on the budget update page, where these documents can be found and how you can find information about allocations made last year. We'll have a brief discussion today too, following on a question that was posed last time about the appropriate size of the institution. How big should the University of Regina get? We started out at the beginning with 27 students. When we got degree granting status, we were about 3,000 or 4,000. We're now above 14,000. Is the plan simply to continue to grow the university if we can grow it? Or is there an appropriate size? And if so, what does that size look like? How many should be undergraduate? How many should be graduate? How many should be domestic? How many should be domestic out of Saskatchewan? How many international? And so on and so forth. And we'll talk about that today. We're also going to highlight something today that we talked about in response to a question last time and that we're spending a fair amount of time talking to government about, and that is what we believe to be an unfair disparity in the per student funding between the two provincial universities. There is a grant made to the post-secondary sector, and then using a complex series of formulas called the Saskatchewan University Funding Mechanism, the ministry decides how those dollars are allocated between the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina. And we want to talk a little bit about that. So if we move now quickly to some of the budget information online, and this is what we want to focus on today, is what's there, and to help you find your way around that, and then to answer any questions that you might have. The University Budget Policy, which is a board-approved policy, and it is the board that has the final authority on the budget, the approval of the budget of the university, and on general business affairs and getting and spending at the university, including the approval of tuition levels. All of that belongs to the board, and the policy is approved by the board. It defines the principles, as you see there, for budget preparation and consultation. Prior to the budget coming in, it is brought before the board by the president and discussed at the board and approved, amended, or theoretically it might not be approved. We're not there yet. That policy is available on the policy website under the title Budget Process. It's a fairly long document. and it's up there on the website. What we've tried to do in response to some of the concerns expressed over the last year is to make this process as transparent as possible, to up the number of consultations that are carried out with bodies on campus, and basically to say to campus, here are the numbers, here is the frame that we're working in. Revenue is basically the grant, which is tax money coming in from the government on behalf of the taxpayers of Saskatchewan. Tuition and fee revenue, and a small amount of other revenue, about 10 cents on the dollar. That's what's coming in. Here's how we spend it. 75% of that is basically salaries and benefits, and then there's everything else, from supplies, through utility payments, through copyright, through library acquisitions. You will have seen quite a bit recently on library acquisitions. And how then do we articulate the decisions made to allocate university resources, that is the grant and tuition basically, out to the various operating units on campus. Dave?
Thank you very much, Tom. As you'd see, we've intentionally gone to split screen here to try and sort of show you where the different information is. In particular, we tried to do it verbally at the last forum, but I think a little bit of a voyage walking through it answers those questions much better. So, first bit, a little bit about the process, is that on the Office of Resource Planning website, you'll find lots of different information. Tom's alluded to some of it already. We'll walk through the different pieces. But you'll find the University of Regina budget as one of those things on there, and an update specifically on 2016-17, which then has the entire process, all of the different steps. Of course, you can see the things that have passed already, and there's links and things to, as Tom mentioned, and as Brian showed, walked through the last budget forum slides that were there if you wanted to look at it, the slides, or if you really want some excitement, you can listen to Tom and I chat. The video is there as well. Of course, today we're at February 8th, the Budget Town Hall. Still lots of work to be done. Probably the most significant thing this year is that with the provincial election and the announcement by the provincial government that there won't be a budget, is we won't be having our normal provincial budget sometime sometimes as early as March, but typically April. This year it won't come until after the election, depending which party gets in. Probably take a little bit longer if there's a change in government, hopefully shorter if it's the same government. But we won't be getting anything until May. So we'll be somewhat delayed there, but otherwise the process is very similar to any other year. So the next thing is just walking through bit by bit. If we go back to the main page again, you'll see a number of different bits of information in there. One of them is operations forecast. And again, if you looked at the process piece, the budget making is a full year-long process and things. We start off, and already this year, we're being asked for projections for next year. Last year, you would have noticed, and we put up the operations forecast we submitted last year for this year. And you'll notice it went in July. It used to go in October. Then it moved to September. This year, they've actually asked for it at the end of April. And of course, then deferred, saying, well, the budget won't be out, so 3 weeks after the budget is when we'll actually be submitting it this year. So date unknown, but an intention of trying to get it earlier and earlier. What the operations forecast is a projection of what the needs are for the university. And so it goes through all kinds of different estimating and such in terms of what the provincial context is, what the environment is at the university, does estimates in terms of different increases, so things like utilities, like projections on salaries, like projections on inflation, you name it, gets built into there. And from that, we then take and build a request to government. They typically come up with guidelines each year. That, for last year, their guideline was, okay, tell us what it would be if there was status quo. So status quo, then how much money do you need? You'll notice based on, we'll stop here for a minute, of course every estimate needs to be based on a number of different assumptions. So these are put front and center into the document. Based on these assumptions, then we can go ahead and answer the questions. So things like 1% inflation for the recoveries part of income, a 3.8% increase in tuition, and of course that was what the government asked us to do in terms of the submission, was use last year's rate increase, and then we'll be able to, based on that, what is the grant increase that you require, and alternately, what's the impact of a 0%. So based on all those different requirements, I won't go through all of them, but you'll be able to read them. Then if we flip to the next page, is the first page in a table that takes and shows, well, what do we need just to maintain status quo? And of course, the biggest chunk of that, if you look at the individual amounts and things like that, is salary, but it takes and results in a 4.4% increase. So government also asked us to take and report what's the impact. So the next table then would be if you replace the 4.4% and put zeros in terms of grant increase. I should highlight as well, as you can see, that it asked for a 3-year projection. And so based on that, and this is what our challenge is, this is what we spoke about at the last forum, but the challenge is in the order of $5 million, $4.8 million, unless we get a 4.4% grant increase. And of course, the other inputs that we talked about last time in terms of what's enrollment going to increase and how much is the grant going to increase, how much is tuition going to increase. Based on those assumptions, a 0% enrollment, a 0% grant, a 3.8% tuition increase, the challenge was $4.8 million. So that's the operations forecast. Again, that is just a wish list. Other things that are built into there, of course, are requests for sustaining capital. And of course, there's always a large argument on that and a huge need. And that is covering both the bricks and mortar kind of equipment needs, but it's also the desktop teaching equipment and et cetera that fits into that budget as well. So we've been arguing for significant increases in that one. The other aspect of it is it's special initiatives. This year we've been given an indication we've never gotten money really for special initiatives. We always go to the effort of writing up lots, but this year they even hinted that there's not going to be an awful lot of movement for special initiatives at all in producing next year's operations forecast, but go ahead, we'd still like to hear of some of them. So likelihood low, but so we'll still be looking at submitting something. So that's the wish list that goes to government. It does have some good baseline information in terms of what projections are, which we use for the next step, which is then coming up with the actual budget. So one of the key things, the actual budget plan is what we end up producing and gets approved at the May board meeting, of course based on the provincial government coming out in time with their budget. We've got a board meeting this year scheduled for 2nd of May. That will be before this year's budget. So the likelihood is that we'll probably have to have a special board meeting this year just to take and approve the budget when it comes out, because our next board meeting isn't until July. So in the comprehensive budget plan, a number of different things. It talks about every one of our different budgets, basically the 5 of them, whether they're the traditional or the largest ones, operating, capital, ancillary, research fund, trust accounts, etc. It speaks to all of the different allocations in all of the different budgets. And then now these are real numbers in terms of what, as opposed to the wish list that's in the operating forecast. So the comprehensive plan, and we've got it up here, it's got all of the different details published by the board, which then leads to the next item, which I'll get to in a minute, but I'll talk a little bit more about this, individual budget letters that has the micro level detail. This is a little bit more macro, talks a little bit in general terms in some particular cases, but has all these different details. Culminates probably the most important part is the individual table that actually states what the different allocations are. So how much did the grant increase? By this point we know what that grant increase is, and then what the different disbursements are into the different accounts. Now to form that budget, there's actually 3 different stages, and that's what all those different columns are. And maybe if you go back up to the headers, Brian, we start off with a base budget for last year, which is the basic plan that was approved from last year. Now there's always changes. most typical one is sometimes and some additional grant money may have come in from the province, or a slight change, so that would be different. But things like enrollment, which are only estimates until they actually happen throughout the year, tend to always change. So in this case, we had some positive increases in enrollment. That goes into the first column in terms of just what are the changes from year to year that then start our different base budgets. Then the next, which would end up being the fourth column, what new money was taken and allocated, either it's in projected revenues on the side of tuition or recoveries, or what is a grant increase is then added to that. The sum total then leads into how much money have we got for this year, and therefore then what is the proposed budget to take and spend it. And as you can see, all the different numbers there. We break it out at the bottom. We just have in tradition to try and illustrate to people two different ways to slice and dice how those expenditures are, sort of by faculty, library, administrative groupings, etc. in the first group of items. And then in the second group of expenditures by the type of expenditure. So the big one, of course, as we mentioned, 75% of our budget is salaries and benefits. And so when you take and look at, okay, an additional increase of $6 million, where did it go? And then break down into salaries, scholarships as the two big pieces. So the next one, as we mentioned, is the individual detail. So this has a fairly significant amount of detail, but a little bit more macro. The intimate detail then gets published as a budget letter to the units. We used to take and do an individual different budget letter to each unit. Over the past number of years, I think for 3 or 4, maybe 5 years now, we've actually taken and published one common budget letter and said, okay, everybody knows exactly what every cent is taken and allocated. What's the change, or some people say, what's the delta from year to year for each unit? Now keep in mind that the 75% of our expenditures and things like that are salary. That salary money actually is dispersed independently, so it looks like cuts going to every unit. The actual units are actually increasing their budgets. But as we've talked about before, the big challenge is the purchasing power is going down, so it feels like a real cut. We talk about cuts when we're taking and making the budgets, but in reality, the budget has been going up each year, and the allocations to units and things like that similarly have gone up each year. So the types of things that are spoken about in this, and this is we don't bother talking about the trust endowment fund and things like that in this budget letter. It's mainly 3 components. It's the operating fund, which is what most people are paying attention to this time. For those people in facilities or those people that are high-intensity equipment users, they look at what's the capital allocation for sustaining capital or preventive maintenance and renewal. And in some cases, we take and allocate one-time money. So last year, that was quite significant. It was about $2.1 million. The year before, it was about $500,000. All of that detail is in the individual budget letter, which has a number of different general comments in terms of how we might have taken and applied different allocations this year. A little bit of argument and background in this particular case as we're talking about tuition and fees and how we sit, because of course a big part of the budget, and particularly if we're getting 0 in terms of government grant and we're increasing tuition and fees by 3.8%, it deserves that we talk a little bit more about tuition, so a little bit more detail there as well. The sustaining capital, the one-time allocations, and then it takes and culminates in a detailed line-by-line allocation by unit. Of course, this same chart, just to show where the money comes, this is identical to the chart that was in the budget plan, which is the macro level, and then the detail, unit by unit, position by position or discretionary budget, one-time money, etc. Indication of what each unit is getting. Red highlighting cuts, blue highlighting investments. You'll notice if you compare even the strategy from years to years, some years we did flat across the board cuts. Last year, as part of the budget process, we heard loud and clear that no, the solution people thought was best would be to do differential cuts. So there were anything from units that got net investments to units that were cut as much as 4%, plus other discretionary amounts. So all of that detail is in those budget letters. As we did comparisons, by the way, to other units and things or other universities, we haven't seen another university yet that has this kind of detail on their budget. And in particular, we think that this budget letter approach with that detail of unit by unit allocations is as detailed as you can possibly get. Of course, the one-time budget allocations and the capital allocations are on there as well. The other bit of information, we'll just flip, it's the same slide over here, talks about the budget book, but we also, on there's the budget book, which has for those people who want to take and look at the data, the budget letter tells you what the change is each year from unit to unit, so either a $100,000 cut or a 1% cut or a position cut. So say, well, what's their baseline and things? Well, all the details of the entire operating fund, every cent that's spent at the university, all 207 of that million is then broken down and is allocated into a fund. 100% of that fund is illustrated in the budget book. We have, of course, a summary of all the different revenues and things, so both recoveries and grants, etc., totaling the $207 million. Then the expenditures, a summary page for each of the different groupings of units, and then faculty by faculty, department by department, admin unit by admin unit gets into the detail starting in the next page on each of the different ones. So there, in this case, starts off with faculties and of course goes alphabetically, and the individual department by departments in each of those faculties. So that gives you the base budget money amount. Next a little bit, people might say, okay, well that's the plan. That was started with the wish list, went to the macro level plan, went to the detailed level plan, went to the allocations in the budget book, each of the unit, said, well, how did you actually spend it? So, okay, there's documents as well. The annual financial report talks about how things are spent. So there's a management discussion analysis. There's an introduction by the president and the board chair. There are details on the risk and applying risk. So the enterprise risk management input. There's performance measurement framework statements and a report card in terms of how did we perform on our targets, etc. And then, of course, statements by the provincial auditors and the financial statements and things like that are all embedded in the annual report. Similarly, and as you've seen, there are all the annual reports. One of the things that we're going to be changing, by the way, is the annual reports and the financial statements were all on the financial services website. We've actually moved them to be on the also cross-linked onto the Office of Resource Planning website, but thought that, well, let's make one more change and put them right down on that left-hand side where it had budget letter, budget book, and all those things, so that you don't have to flip between different places to find the different things. So there's the annual report, and then the other a bit of information, of course, the detailed financial statements, all audited, all checked by numerous people as well. Key ones being, of course, the provincial auditor report. These things, by the way, get tabled in the legislature as well. Typically, we have to have them in by September. They're normally published and gazetted or whatever by sometime in November. The other bit of information that, and we highlighted, it's a small part, but something that people asked for in terms of transparency. Well, what about travel expenses? And as you know, for the past couple years, we have been publishing the Travel expenses, in fact, the President went one step further and published travel expenses all the way back to when she was engaged, hired here at the university. And of course, there's the details on a quarterly basis every quarter in terms of details. So in terms of that kind of expenditure, Brian's clicking on the last one from May to August, a little bit small here, but each and every trip that any one of the vice presidents or the president takes are recorded and published on the website as well. Tom.
So that's quite a bit on the expenses side. I want to go back to the revenue side and a bit of a discussion about student numbers. And Brian, I don't know if you could bring up that graph that's on the main page of the budget update showing the population projections from Stats Canada. Our basic issue is this. The province, as you know, is building new schools for that influx of principally new Canadians, bringing kids, having kids, and that population bulge in that area, that demographic area, we're not going to see out here for some years. So if we just, it's on the budget update page. I'll get it in a sec. There we are. And then over on the right. You have to scroll over to the right. We just want to show you what we're trying to plan for, given that student tuition, student fees will make up, within a few years, fully 40% of our operating budget. That is 40% of what we need to do to operate the university on a day-to-day basis and to pay salaries and benefits will be coming from students. So we have to pay attention to our enrollments and our student retention in a way that we perhaps have never done before at this university. In the days when I was an undergraduate, student tuition revenue was maybe 20 to 25% of the budget. Now it is close to 40%. So if you see, and again, this is really difficult to read, but what it means is that our traditional catchment area, the population of Saskatchewan high school graduating students from whom we have drawn historically, the majority of our students is in decline. And will continue to be in decline out until about 2022, 2023 before it starts picking up again. So we're looking right now, we're trying to plan for about 7 successive fiscal years from now forward in which the pool from which we have recruited the majority of our students will begin to shrink, or has begun to shrink already. What does that mean? It means very simply we have to recruit more students from outside that area. We need to recruit more Canadian students from outside Saskatchewan. And we need to think carefully about our international recruitments as well, just to maintain current levels of enrollment, let alone grow the campus. We're trying to do other things as well by offering classes in different ways. We began a few years ago to experiment with UR Early to cater to students who wanted classes at 7:30 in the morning. There are not a lot of them, but there are several hundred of them every term, which enables us to stretch the use of existing facilities while growing the campus population slightly. The enrollment in online courses has dramatically increased over the past 5 years. Some of that is traditional undergraduates taking a course or two as part of their on-campus program. They may be in a dorm room doing an online course. More importantly, we're seeing more mid-career professionals in programs like the Master's in Health Administration and the projected Master of Health Information Management program taking online courses from across the country. We now have students registered in University of Regina courses at the master's level, fully online, from practically every province and territory in the country. Lying behind that, though, is a whole series of questions. How big can this campus become? How much do we want to grow this campus in an increasingly competitive environment? Another question that lies behind that is, as we grow that population, as we bring in more students, student needs get more diverse and they increase. So we need more supports for students in terms of advising. We need more supports for students in terms of mental health counseling. We need generally more support for a much broader variety of students than we had, say, 20 or 25 years ago. And each of those things comes with a cost. So we can increase our student body by diversifying it and by bringing in more students from outside our traditional catchment area. By and large, that increases our costs. We also need to worry, of course, about class size, about workload for faculty and staff, and everything else that goes on with increasing enrollments. what I'd leave you with on this slide too is the question that we perhaps struggle with the most as we try to think our way through this, and that is a very simple rule in enrollment planning, in enrollment management. The farther away that your students come from geographically, the more fragile those enrollments are. So students who are living in Regina are a pretty solid bet in terms of retention. If, however, a student comes from Ontario, the likelihood that we have to compete hard to attract and then retain that student in the face of many Ontario universities, or indeed international students, means that those enrollments are not quite as secure as our traditional home base enrollments. Expand that to the international scenario, and international enrollments can be very fragile. All it takes is a political decision in a country that is supplying us with a couple of hundred international students to do away with a scholarship program, and we're down 200 students in the space of a couple of weeks. Saudi Arabia, as you know, we have quite a few Saudi Arabian students. Many of them have been very generously supported in Canada for the past 6 years by the King Abdullah program, scholarship program, fully funded students at the expense of the government of Saudi Arabia. Given where oil is right now, the Saudi government has cut funding to that program in parts of eastern Canada, and though we still enjoy the funding here, we need to plan for what would happen if a number of Saudi students suddenly turned around and went home because the bills are no longer being paid. Similarly, about 6 years ago in Australia, Australian universities had made a tremendous effort to attract students from Malaysia and Southeast Asia, and they did very well. There was then a single incident of violence in Sydney against an international student, and within the space of less than a year, they lost tens of thousands of enrollments from Southeast Asia and billions of dollars of tuition revenue. So those are some of the things that we need to consider in the mix of enrollment planning. And then, as I said earlier too, we need to think, what's the proper undergraduate-graduate balance? At the graduate level, what's the proper balance between research graduate students, those who are actually in labs, in archives, doing archival research, doing scientific creation and discovery, doing scholarship and creative activity in the Faculty of Media, Art and Performance? Or do we up the balance, or do we up the numbers of students who are mid-career professionals who want professional degrees that are not necessarily research degrees at the master's level? What are the complexities there? Finally, the student residence. And we want to just remind everyone that the student residences system, of which now we're getting a bigger one with the opening of Keswick this fall, is completely separate from the operating budget of the university. Right? It is in the ancillaries budget, and overall, the ancillaries must pay for themselves. There's some cross-subsidization. Some years parking has a good year and food services needs a bit of a help, and will balance within that. Or food services has a good year but parking is short. Overall, though, the ancillaries cannot be a draw on the operating budget. More important than that, though, is the very simple fact that the more students, particularly first-year students you have living on campus, the better your retention rate is. Our chances of retaining a first-year student who may be having difficulty making friends or struggling a little bit academically go up by, we estimate, 20% if that student is actually living on campus rather than living in a basement apartment, say behind the Golden Mile Plaza. So the whole strategy around the building of student residences, and you see this at many universities in North America, from the really great wealthy universities like Harvard and Yale and so on, to universities in Canada like Western and Mount Allison, where it's almost a requirement for first-year students to live on campus, unless they've got a very good reason not to, is basically not only to help socialize them and integrate them into the life of the university, but to make sure that they're retained, because they are our prime mission for existing here in Regina is to teach those students. They're also very important and increasingly important to us in terms of revenue. So the initial business case for the towers asked for a provincial contribution of $24.3 million. To date, we received 11, 10 of which was for the residents and $1 million for daycare, roughly speaking.
No, 11 from the residents. 1 million for design, 10
$1 million for design, thank you. And
daycare, we got extra.
We got a little bit extra for the daycare. We have those spaces in Keswick. And we continue to press the government to complete the contribution that was originally contemplated when those towers were planned and the business case was made. Obviously, the province finds itself in a financial tight spot, but we continue to make that case, and to seek the remaining $13.3 million that we'd asked. Finally, I'll leave you with this. And we spoke about it at the last forum, so forgive us for repeating. We think this is a very important point. And I'd put it to you in the form of a question. Is a business student, or an arts student, or a science student, or a nursing student, a kinesiology student, any of the 80% of our enrollments that we have in common, same discipline enrollments at Regina and Saskatoon, is that young student at Regina worth less than their counterpart at the University of Saskatchewan? We are arguing with government, and we accept fully the cost of providing medical education is very high. We accept fully that the cost of providing vet education, dentistry education on a per student basis is very high, and more public money goes into those areas so that we have trained professionals who we hope will stay and practice those specialties in the province. We accept all of that. But if you do an apples to apples comparison of an arts student, a history student, an English student, a physics student, a biology student, a nursing student, take any of the areas we have in common. All of our engineering students, though the engineering areas differ, we both have colleges or faculties of engineering. We are trying to advance continually the argument that University of Regina students in common areas are worth no less than their counterparts at the University of Saskatchewan. We believe that there has been an imbalance there, and we are working very hard to persuade the government to take a look at this, because it is very important to our funding levels. It has a bearing on what we have to charge tuition, or charge students in the form of tuition, and it has a bearing on what we can pay our employees and the number of employees that we have. So we're saying, I'll give you one final example of that. If you look at business enrollments at the two universities, Regina's enrollments all in are between about 1,700 and 1,800, undergraduate, graduate, everybody in business. Saskatoon's are about 500 students greater, about 2,200. These are rough numbers, and they will need double and triple checking. And yet, by our analysis, their staffing levels in the Edwards School, which is their faculty of business, compared to ours, are up to 50% higher. A 50% larger complement of APT and QP employees working in the College of Business up there for only 500 additional students, a larger faculty complement, and as we're all aware, better salaries for those people. We're saying we need you as our elected representatives and the people we work with to ensure a good education for students here and fair treatment for employees here. We need you to look at this and work with us. And we're doing that again on Wednesday afternoon at a meeting on the funding mechanism as part of almost monthly discussions on the issue of what we view as a funding disparity. Needless to say, our colleagues at the University of Saskatchewan have assembled a strong case to maintain what is the status quo right now. And just a couple of things from the thing that was handed out to you. As you know, we commissioned an impact study from Economic Development Regina. There are just some highlights there. What we're trying to do with that, what the President tried to do before the Chamber of Commerce a couple of weeks ago, with 300 and some people in the audience, was to say, don't view the university as an expense. View it as a tremendous investment in the future, first of all. This is the future of the province, educating young people. But also take a look at some of the economic benefits and the economic impact that the university has on the community. We pay more as a group of University of Regina employees. We pay more in income tax to the federal and provincial governments than we receive in the government grant from the province of Saskatchewan. Our students spend tens of millions of dollars a year in the local economies, supporting everything from pizza shops to car repair. We all pump money into the local economy, and we're, again, trying to make the case the university, far from being a drain on public resources, is a tremendous engine of economic activity and growth in the metropolitan region. So we'll finish up now by reminding you that on the 13th in the Education Auditorium at 3, the next one of these updates will occur. Everything remains available on that page, and we're now going to turn it over to you for any questions or comments you might have. Please come to the microphone, please identify yourself, and if we can't come up with an answer, we'll do our best to get one to you at the next town hall. Thank you.
Dennis Fitzpatrick. I'm from the Faculty of Science, and I'm with the Faculty Association. I appreciate the documents you have published. In fact, I pulled some of them down on the weekend and did a little bit of homework. I appreciate the way the budget process goes through. The basic tenet of the budget process is very conservative in that you underestimate income and overestimate expenses, and that gives you a real cushion. I calculated that $23.6 million over the last 4 years is the extra revenue that has come in through that mechanism. And so I took that information and I went to the audited financials. And I was looking at the funds. And when I got to the operating fund, I was expecting, or I was anticipating, that because of this extra revenue, that the fund balance, which is the cash on hand, would be in pretty good shape. Now, it wasn't. That's the way it goes, I guess. But what it also took me to that page which showed interfund transfers. And I looked at the interfund transfer last year, and one of the things that I noticed was that there was a significant interfund transfer to the Special Projects Fund. Now, that 1 year isn't much, but what I did do was I went back the last 4 years, and I saw into this non-operating fund that there was $25 million put into that fund in interfund transfers. The fund went from about $10 million to $35 million in that period of time. $35 million in a fund which has about $5 million in transactions and certainly isn't operational transactions. And my question is, we're talking about gloom and doom, we're talking about problems with the budget, and there's $35 million, largely money that gets given to the university for operating expenses, sitting outside the normal operating accounts. And my understanding, and it comes from conversations with Dave Button, was that these funds were sequestered funds, and that, as you said with the residences, that they're separate and apart. And so can you help me understand what's going on?
Why don't I just kick that off? Dave will do the interfund transfers. On the conservative budgeting principle, we have for the past couple of years budgeted at 0% enrollment increases. But in the last couple of years, our enrollments have gone up. Why we continue to budget at 0% is what I said earlier. As more of our enrollments become more fragile, if we build in base operating expenses, that is the salaries and benefits of continuing employees, on the basis of enrollments that then don't materialize, we're in major trouble. So that's the conservative end of projecting enrollments at 0%. We also think, Dennis, that we're probably seeing the last year or so of the kind of enrollment increases we've seen over the past 5 or 6. If we can continue to maintain that pace, we will be lucky. We think we're going to see a mitigation in that increase, and we may in fact go down to 0 within a year or 2. So that's the conservative end. Do you want to speak to the interfund transfers?
Sure. And first of all, I'm not sure whether I'd be able to follow your math and things, but one of the simple things, if you're doing a cumulative total over a number of different years, is a number of those numbers would probably be duplicated. So let me give you a couple of different examples of what goes into the special projects funds and things. Each unit, and you may, if you have looked at the financial statements and things last year, there was a fairly healthy carry forward from each of the individual faculties, except just about every faculty did have some surplus. In all cases, it was, they have targeted uses of that, and often it's just the good budgeting principles that we enjoy here at the university that other governments don't have. So provincial government, federal government don't have carry forward. So people end up making bad budget decisions at the end of the year just to take and spend the money for the sake of spending it rather than taking and planning it. So a number of different units. I'll use a couple of different examples. One that I tend to use an awful lot because people can see the logic behind it is the towel fund. You'll find if you look under special projects and things, and I don't see kinesiology here, but my recollection is it gets up to sometimes $300,000. It might have been $200,000 last year. And so if you're adding cumulatively and you're saying there it is, well, it's the same money if each year it takes and grows. So in the towel fund, outside of the operating budget, many of us pay for fitness and lifestyle center fees. Many of us pay for the locker and towel service and things. Some of us plug quarters into the lockers. That money takes and accumulates until the dean or faculty administration within kinesiology decides it's time to replace the lockers, time to buy new towels and things. And so those special project funds take and protect that money for them for a special purpose. Every one of them is justified in that way. Similarly, we might look at the library as another example. So there's an example of some money. Is it surplus? It's definitely not base. Often it's outside and is being accumulated from other sources of money other than operating, in the case of the towel fund. In the case of a unit that has some surplus money looking to, could be science, just to take and help with new researchers or to take and outfit a lab. But one recently, as we know in the library, to take and invest in a new library system and things, saving and accumulating a little bit of money over a few years to then take and invest in something that is critical. A project like that takes a couple of years to take and accumulate. So some of those funds, every one of them, again, identified as a special purpose, applied for and gotten approval to take and save the money to carry forward it into the next year into a special project fund, and it sits there for a special purpose. Government also was interested in that type of question. In fact, has looked at both universities very closely. And so we have spent many hours with the advanced education people taking and going through all of those special project accounts, all of what some people might deem as surplus, and the conclusion is by far there is no surplus money. Indeed, what I would give a vote of thanks and congratulations to virtually all budget managers here at the university who can see that things are getting worse around the country, around the province, etc. Budgeting frugally and therefore ending up the year with a little bit of surplus, mainly knowing that they want to take and do some special project, but in particular taking and protecting against any shock for the faculty or the unit in the upcoming year. So often leaving, say, a leave that, or someone that retires early or leaves and not filling the position immediately to be able to take and give a bit of a cushion for the following year. That money then takes and falls to the bottom line. It's not base money, but it can then be used in a special project which takes and benefits the faculty as well.
I'm having a little trouble with that because, and I'm talking about year over year net expenses. There's a net increase in 2011 of $2.5 million. The next year, the net increase is $3.7 million. The next year, the net increase is $9.357 million. The next year, it's 2.5, and last year, it was $8.2 million. We now have 20 times the amount of money sitting in the special project fund as is sitting in the operations fund, and we've got continual growth. So this notion that it's a bank, help me with this data to tell me that it's a bank, because my understanding of your explanation was they were putting us away for a special project in the future, and all I see is an accumulation of money in an account which does not appear to be related to operational activities, and the money's coming out of operations. So I'm struggling with your answer, David.
Let me try to give you a bit more detail on the library one, because I know a bit about that one, and Colleen Murphy is here to explain further. The library has been saving systematically, going back now about 4 or 5 years, to pay for what's called this new discovery layer. We don't have the finances in any given year to put out the 800,000 or whatever the amount is to buy that new software system and get it loaded and get all of the data into it and everything else. So the library, through position vacancy management, has been keeping back, kind of saving bits and pieces of operating each year, and it built up a fairly sizable amount now, the better part of $1 million, I think, to buy that thing, which should be coming this year. And what that then system will permit is ready access, not just to the resources of the University of Regina Library, to everybody in the room, but the resources of all of the partner libraries in Regland. So that's one example. Another example that I was aware of personally when I was in arts years ago is that we built up over the space of probably 5 years, close to $750,000 savings sitting in one of these accounts. And what we wanted to do was to use that as part of the renovations to the 3rd floor of the classroom building. So they seem like large amounts. They tend to be put together bit by bit each year, but when they're finally dispersed, they're gone, and that money is gone. It is not base.
Let me try with another couple of examples then, because I'm trying to make this simple, but the Interfund Transfers, first of all, one of the comments was that it's out of the operating fund, and I think I illustrated one example where it could come from other additional cash in the TALO fund. Another good example that just makes good business sense is things like the Evergreen project. As we know, everybody here has a desktop computer. It gets replaced, or the monitor on a 4 or 5 year cycle, and that fund is funded through the capital fund, so sustaining capital. But based on the experience of the IS people and what's convenient for people, it tends to be more convenient to take and replace it rather than trying to rush the purchase and buy it for the end of April and install it before the 1st of May in the new budget year when faculty and others are extremely busy, rather to get a student employment program and do it in the summertime. So the $600,000 or so that would go into that program would be put from capital, in this case, into a special purpose fund to take and fund that Evergreen project. So it would sit there and look like, from your description, might look like it's surplus, it's money that could go towards something else. Well, no, it was allocated for a special purpose. It sits there for a few months in a special purpose fund. As you know, we do that every year. We take an upgrade, so it looks like it's money in there. And every year there would be similar things like that, but no, it's not accumulating, so you can't add them all up and say that all of that surplus money is there. And it's all targeted. So is it surplus? I'd say no. So hopefully that
David,
3rd or 4th example helps.
That's exactly what you've done in the book. You've added it all up. If you go back through the budget book, if you go back through not the budget book, if you go through the audited financials, you've got the start of the year, the end of the year, the net change, and then the money being transferred into it. So I'm a little bit confused that this money is moving in and out if it just appears to be moving in. And I mean, your explanations don't support the data. Maybe there's a disconnect. But
well, I don't know where you're getting your data from. If it's from the capital sheets and
no,
things.
from your audited financial statements which deal specifically with this fund.
And if you're looking at the accumulation of all different funds, so things like, let me give you some examples of other things that then take and look like some big changes year to year. Residence project would be a good example. One year, the year that we took and borrowed 58 million, it's going to show as an entry of $58 million flowing in that year. So that year is going to have extra money in the budget allocation. But the expenditures are probably coming a year or 2 years later. So that year, it's going to show a bunch of expenditures with no income coming in and things. And so if you're just looking on a summary basis, that's why I have no idea where you're pulling the numbers from, but whether you're truly comparing apples to apples The unfortunate part is you can't take that and then lead people to believe that that means that there's $35 million extra at this university. That would be a gross misrepresentation of financial statements and numbers. And so I have no idea where you're pulling those numbers from, but I'd suggest that perhaps, and as I mentioned before, be glad to sit down face to face and walk through all of them with you. Yeah. Good. Annual report.
With the audited financials and
Absolutely.
the 4
Yeah.
previous audited financials. I don't know any other better source of information. We appear to be going round and round, but I would actually,
I'd
I
suggest
think
that
the
there's
community
that
needs,
there's a misinterpretation of what you're looking at in terms of what that means to the university's bottom line. And we'd be glad to take and explain. If you wanted to tell us exactly what it is, because in the past I've responded to those things, and well, I haven't heard back with the arguments that my arguments or my explanations where it's been missing. So other than that, just pulling numbers out of the blue, hopefully we've answered them for you. If not, go ahead and provide us a little bit clearer question, and we can take and answer it.
thank you.
We've also spent some time recently with the Council Committee on Budget, the elected committee from Council, on precisely that issue of interfund transfers, which is complex. It takes some time to understand, but there are no gaps, factual gaps, between the audited financial statements and the other budget documents that we prepare. Obviously, under board oversight, under the oversight of the Provincial Auditor, under the oversight of our staff working through all of these things, no. It takes time to understand some of this stuff, and as Dave says, if people want to spend a couple of hours working through this, we'll find time to spend a couple of hours working through this with you.
Hi, I just wondered, could we have some clarification? So there was this $24.3 million that was included in the business case for the residences. And this has been my question since before the residences were even a glimmer. And then the province has only given 11 million. So where was the miscommunication or the misdirect? What happened? What did the government say to you in writing? Yes, we accept your business case for X amount of dollars, but then only gave you 11 million? Or how did we get into this situation where we have a $13.3 million chunk of money that we have to find ourselves?
We have to borrow. Very, very quickly, in the initial run-up to the project, a verbal commitment was made. In the end, we got a cash amount with an indication that the balance would be coming. The financial situation took a turn for the worst, and the balance hasn't come yet. So we've obviously increased our borrowing. That's going to increase the costs to the students who actually are in that complex. We are confident that eventually the money will come through from the province. We're also taking into account, Tanya, the fact that if we have those students in residence, we stand a better chance of retaining them and therefore increasing our tuition and fee revenue on which we're becoming increasingly reliant.
Yeah, but we have increased our debt. We've increased presumably the length of the mortgage, which is going to be interest that we pay yearly.
We're still paying off the last bits of debt, or we may have just paid it off on College West residence, which was built in 1974.
Well, in fact, we've still got a little ways to go. That's a 50-year debenture that we can't get out of, so 50 years from 1974. But you're absolutely right. That's why we highlighted a bit of a concern. That's part of the problem with respect to only single-year budgets provincially. So the indication the first year we got $1 million to do design. Every indication, full speed ahead, go with design, get going. Subsequent year, $10 million, which was actually phased in over 2 years. So we got $5 million one year, $5 million the next. And of course, we're waiting with patiently to see this year's budget cycle to see if the difference comes up. Those of you that are really attuned in the and look at our financial statements and things like that in terms of how much we've booked as an anticipated revenue this year for that. We've actually only booked 10 million in concert with sort of good financial practice in terms of what you anticipate getting, that we might not get the full 13.3.
So, but I guess my question is, why did we go ahead when we didn't have written agreement from the government? We had the 1 million to do the design, et cetera, that happened. Why did we break ground when we didn't have what we proposed in our business case in hand? That's what I don't understand.
A couple different answers to that question. Of course, we had the project itself is an absolute bonus and things like that for the university in so many other ways in terms of helping the operating budget by being able to recruit and retain more students, and in theory, better students. All of the research shows that students who live in residence are more successful. So a whole bunch of tangible and other intangible benefits for the university to take and do it. And of course, at that time, and again, we're still optimistic, that we will get all of the different money. The worst case fallback solution is, well, what's the impact if we don't get any of the money? And this is something that we don't necessarily like to advertise because it takes pressure off the funders, is that, yeah, we'll have to make do. It might, it again won't touch the operating budget. It will mean, as you've alluded to, either higher rents for students or, and, probably not or, but and longer payback periods until the residents themselves are sustainable. And as I'd mentioned in, I think it was 2 town halls ago, we talked about it in a little bit more detail. It's a bigger impact if you look at this one residence in isolation and its single business case. But if you look at the sum total of all residences, and if you look at the sum total of all the ancillaries, then that's what we look at in terms of the bottom line, in terms of impact to ancillaries. And the good news is the north and south residents, their business case and their payback period has been accelerated quite significantly. It's been quite successful. And so that, the profits and such from that will end up compensating for some of the losses in Kissick if we don't get the funding.
It just seems that it's a bit of a pattern with respect to new buildings on campus. That, I mean, the other new residences aside, it's just a concern for me, which is why I brought up the issue before we broke ground on the residences. And maybe it can alter the way that we plan in future.
I'm just wondering, when you say a pattern with the other exception of the other one that was...
Well, I mean, my understanding, and I could be wrong, but my understanding was that when the Rizal Center was built, it went over budget and funds were taken from different places to cover that.
That would be totally incorrect. The Rizal Center was not 1 penny over budget.
Okay.
What you
And we
might
had all the funds from the government to pay for that as well?
Absolutely. It was cost shared, basically a third between Provincial, Federal, and the university. And all of the 100% of that money came through. What you might be referring to, if someone was talking about our fundraising targets weren't met. And so we had both internal fundraising targets for university, and that wasn't met. And so about 3 years after it opened, we took and said, okay, we're going to quit the fundraising on that project. We'll borrow the money. And so it's been an expense there.
It would be nice to see the outcome of this project impact future policy on new buildings on campus. I guess
thanks for that. I just throw one other thing to those towers, and all residence and ancillaries operations are something on which we're going to become increasingly dependent for additional revenues in the summer. So for example, the Canada-wide Science Festival next year will have close to 1,000 people paying us residence fees, otherwise for empty rooms, that summer. And the following, of course, with Congress coming in, and up to 5,000 or 6,000 people coming to Congress, maybe 7,000 if we get lucky, those things will be full and generating a tremendous amount of revenue that otherwise we would not have.
Which compensates for all the other projects that are going into the Congress, like the wayfinding projects and all of that.
It helps, yes, it very much helps, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Brian also just reminded me of another significant point with respect to concerns around the business case and things like that. One of the things by moving quickly when we did was achieved interest rates and things that were far, far better than the business plan. So like any business plan, some of the net changes, some are positive, some are negative. A big one, of course, is interest rates. And so over a 25-year period, an improvement by more than 1% a year from what we got to what the original business case had.
Okay.
Thanks for that again. And I just had one final thing, both in terms of operating support, grant support, and things like these special projects. We're in election season. And when you have people coming to your door asking for your vote, gently remind them of the fact that the university is not only a key part of the province's future in the development of intellectual capital and innovation, it is a tremendous benefit, financial benefit for the province, and the province supporting it adequately, operating and in projects like this, is something that any elected official should, I hope, bear in mind.
Hi, Florian Planchuk, Vice President QP 5791. At the last presentation, you raised the issue of the non-academic pension plan, and obviously we've seen the aggressive approach that you've taken ahead of our negotiations. My concern is that we are aware that in some cases managers are getting creative at attracting people, in some cases hiring people above the entry point, which creates friction in departments. So my question to you is, if you're having difficulties attracting people, why are you taking away one of our last benefits? Thank you.
Well, there's a whole bunch of different comments in there. I'm not sure what the hiring at the higher level part is, but so if you want to expand on that, maybe I'd be able to answer it. But let me talk about the pension bit. All the pension decisions are made as a joint committee and elected representatives on the QP side in terms of representing their group. So both pensioners are represented on the committee and university folks. And I might mention as well that there are people in that pension plan that aren't necessarily universities, so people like our federated colleges, Mackenzie Art Gallery, etc. All the decisions will be made jointly as a committee. This isn't the management acting unilaterally, but it's your pension committee looking at the realities and trying to build something that actually serves the members most appropriately. And the challenge is that every member is different, and that's why we've had a series of, there were, I think, 3 different brochures that went out. There were about another 3 different public hearings. There were working focus groups to take and understand. And the feedback from all of that has come back clearly that there is a huge difference in terms of what the different members want. And the unfortunate problem right now is to try and come up with a solution that serves all people. And so to portray it as it's what management wants, no, it's what's good for the people in terms of, from the management perspective, all that we've got is a legislative requirement to take and manage the program on behalf of the members and file official valuations that show that the plan is sustainable and the plan is fully comprehensive and works. So we have to file that by September of this year. So sometime between now and September, which means by now and June really, the membership needs to sort out exactly what kind of pension plan they want. And right now it's what they call underwater in the most simplest terms, and requires either a reduction of benefits or an increase in contributions or a change in the model. And so the members will have to decide that. And that's what all of this information and such is. And so the biggest difference is that right now, for a newer or younger member, they're taking and subsidizing the older member in the simplest of terms. And so somehow that has to take and be reconciled amongst the members. So that's where it's important. If I can encourage you at all, and I know that the Benefits Committee people are doing it, people have to get out there and speak to one another. They have to attend these focus groups. They have to, last week a survey went out asking people what they want. We need them to take and fill out the survey. And based on that, then the committee, their representatives will have to come up with a recommendation in terms of how do we take and reconcile these different opinions to come up with a plan that serves everyone. Because it's in I could tell you, it's hard to, it will be hard to recruit if you get a pension plan that isn't attractive. That used to be what some of our key driving things at the university were, and we want, that's exactly what management wants as well.
Are there any other questions from those present? If not, we're a little bit over time. Dave and I want to thank you very much for coming. Brian, thank you very much for running the show. If there are any further questions, if we go back one slide, any suggestions, but also questions, budget@uregina.ca. We will do our best to answer those questions or come back at the next forum with answers then. So thank you again for coming. We look forward to continuing to work with everybody on the university campus as we seek a way through the challenges that we and just about every other Canadian university are facing this year. And it looks like it's going to continue for a couple more years. So thank you for coming today. This video will be up within a day or two, together with a slide presentation on the budget update page. Thanks.
Thanks very much.